Hi everyone, my name is Yinuo Chen. I'm an artist at Embark Studios, and I'm here today to talk to you about things I've learned during my first year in the games industry. I hope my learnings can be as helpful to you during your first years as they were to me. So, I'd love to start by introducing myself. I started attending digital arts and entertainment, which is a school with majors related to game development, in 2018, which is also the same university that Timothy went to. I didn't start off wanting to pursue 3D, but I discovered my passion for it during my studies. After my studies, I got to work on Avatar Frontiers of Pandora as a level art intern. And after my internship, I decided to work at Embark, in which I have been an artist for 1.5 years. The reason why my title is so vague at Embark is because at Embark, you can decide to take on tasks of many different disciplines. So, for example, I have been doing environment art, 3D art, and tools at Embark. There was even a period in which I worked in the characters team, which was really interesting and meaningful because we're a smaller team per project. Everyone who wants to can wear different hats. So that's kind of been my experience in the industry so far. Before I get into the presentation, here's a summary of what I will be speaking about today. First, I'll speak about my learnings during my internship and tips for your internship. Next, I'll talk about my experience with work-life balance and how to make sure that you're fulfilled both in and outside of work. And lastly, I'll speak on mental challenges that you may face in the industry and tips for overcoming them. Then we'll wrap up the presentation with a Q&A. So now you found an internship or your first job in the industry. What can you expect and what is expected of you during your first weeks in the role? When you join a company as an intern or as someone who has no prior experience in the industry, you will be assigned a mentor or a buddy who will be your main point of contact for questions and tasks. As you become more independent, you can get tasks directly from your lead or art director. In your first few days, expect to read through documentation. When you work on a well-established IP, they will usually have many guides for how art needs to look. Understanding the art Bible and specific requirements for the art helps you create a more satisfactory product. Also, expect to playtest the game and begin to learn any new softwares you might need for the role. Many studios work with a custom engine, specialized tools and pipelines, or use software that you're not familiar with. Most students, like me, only know one 3D software when they enter the industry, and using a new 3D software that is different to the one that you learned 3D with can feel scary. And although the number of software you know doesn't matter, being open to learning new software is a key part of being a good game designer. And although it may seem frustrating at first, it is important to be open-minded and give the software patience and time. Doing your internship can already be stressful, so having to learn new software on top of that can feel very daunting. But understand that no one is expecting you to learn the software quickly, so don't worry if you need to take your time. For example, Embark uses Blender as our 3D software, and most artists who join the company have never used it before. However, everyone swears by it now, and for good reason. So don't worry if you're applying for a position that will use software you've never used. Once you feel comfortable with starting tasks, they will be smaller and more manageable, and leaves a lot of room for you to explore new software or develop a sense for the art direction. For example, expect to be assigned a contained area that needs prop dressing, work with another artist on their area, or to create a background prop. Tasks like those get you used to the UI, the pipeline, and you can start to get an understanding of how things work at the company. When I started my internship, I remember feeling like I had to perform just as well in my tasks as I did in my portfolio pieces. However, it's not a reasonable target for yourself because the time and scope of your tasks don't normally allow for it, and working in a game environment is very different to working on a portfolio piece. What you should be aiming for instead is for things to just work, as in no intersecting props and clear paths for player traversal. If you're able to add your artistic touch to the area, then that is a bonus. But even if you don't, simply creating a working product will be very satisfactory. Trying to make things work and also look incredible is difficult, especially at first, so it is better to focus on the finished product working instead of trying to make it be both at the same time. Oh, I just saw that Timothy had a question. What did you want to do before doing 3D? So actually, when I joined DAE, I wanted to become a concept artist. Very specifically, a character concept artist, nothing else. But I realized in DAE that I actually hated design. I like it a bit more now, but I really didn't like doing it when I was in school. So it was kind of lucky that I ended up liking 3D because otherwise I don't know what I would be doing now. Okay, anyway, back to the talk. So I remember being incredibly nervous during the first weeks of my internship, which was great in the sense that it allowed me to be present. But knowing these tips beforehand would have definitely made the experience more enjoyable. First, understand that no one expects good or even decent work from you in the beginning. You may be learning new software, working in a new engine, and working with special pipeline and tools that you've never seen before. That combined with the fact that actual game development is very different from creating portfolio pieces, and it is easy to see that it would be unreasonable for you to expect yourself to be performing at the same level as your colleagues. Mistakes are easily forgiven when you're an intern or a junior, and even expected from you. If you never made mistakes, then you wouldn't be a human, but a machine. So when you screw up, remember to be kind to yourself and learn from the experience instead of letting it get to you. Of course, this is much more easily said than done, and I am still practicing this myself, but it is good to keep this in the back of your mind. So then what should you be doing as an intern? First, you should be asking a lot of questions. If you see someone using a technique you don't understand, or if you've been stuck on a task, it is your responsibility to reach out to your peers and ask for help. The point of doing an internship is to A, learn about the industry and what it is like to work in it, and B, proving to the company that you have potential so that they offer you a position at the end of your internship. Asking lots of questions allows you to both grow and shows your potential to learn. That being said, it is a good idea to always Google your questions before asking someone, as it shows that you're proactive in learning. A habit that can help your learnings is to keep a journal during your internship. After the nerves start to settle, your time as an intern can really fly by. And it becomes difficult to see how much you've grown in such a short period of time. Keeping a journal reminds you of things you have learned during the internship and allows you to reflect on your experiences in a way that leads to further learnings. Additionally, at the end of your internship, your journal can be a great read and help you learn more about yourself, both artistically and mentally. My next tip might be a personal pet peeve, but I think that it is always good to think before complaining. As in, think whether the complaint is aimed at improving workflows or if you're complaining about something that people can do little about. For example, if you feel like complaining about something in the engine, maybe instead you should be asking about how others deal with this inconvenience. Or if you want to complain about a tool, maybe you should instead be asking the tool's developer about whether the feature is in the works. No, complaining unproductively can not only give your colleagues a worse impression of you, it also hinders you from possibly learning new things. Because people are less likely to help you with solutions when you complain, as opposed to you asking a question or giving constructive feedback. Starting in a company without prior experience in the industry can be very scary, but I suggest embracing the new information with open arms and jumping into assignments headfirst. People expect you to make mistakes, and the way I see it is you're either going to make them in the beginning or somewhere down the line. Hence, my philosophy is that it is always better to not shy away from trying new things, because the worst that can happen is that you learn from it. I see another question. Do you think it matters being a bit older, 30s, 40s, doing an internship? I don't think it matters at all. I think I don't want to say pros and cons, but I think the company will see pros and cons of each because when you're a bit younger, the connotation is that you have more quote unquote potential. I don't think this is the case, but people think that when you're younger you can learn faster and all these things. But I think on the other hand, if you're a bit older, you're way more mature, which is really great. It's always good to have more like mature people in the team who knows how to handle different like social situations, and you also know how to handle yourself as a person way better. So I don't think it like I only see it being a good thing really. Like as long as your portfolio is good, I don't see it being better that you're younger. And I think actually many people will have much more respect for you for trying to enter a new industry when you're a bit older, because that is a very difficult thing to do. So yeah. And if you're in your 30s, 40s, and you're going to do an internship, mad respect, man. Like that's really, really cool. So, um, okay, next slide. Uh, yes. Okay, so learning about game development is very different to actually working in the field, which is true for most other industries as well. As I mentioned previously, no one expects you to know the differences right off the bat. When you're working in the industry, although the visual fidelity of your work is important, you should put equally as much attention in the aspects of game development that you do not learn while working on portfolio pieces. The biggest difference I felt was the difference between working for one beautiful shot versus working in a scene that will be viewed from every angle. I didn't create many playable environments prior to my internship, and it was definitely one of the biggest things I had to learn, and I'm still learning. Although there are differences between third and first person games, here are some general tips. First, focus on areas where the player approaches from. This means to take into account from which angles the players will first see the space. So doors, pathways to the space, etc. This also means propping in a way that leads the players into areas you want them to go. The second is to use parallax between objects. Because the player moves through the space, you can take into account how the space moves while the player is moving through it. So having multiple layers of objects reveals and hides things as you move through the space, which helps the space look more interesting after the initial reveal. If you're having some trouble, pick some still camera angles in your scene and dress them from those angles first. Because taking an entire scene into account can feel very overwhelming, so breaking it down into smaller shots and areas helps you solve one small problem at a time instead of tackling the entire thing at once. The next tip is to work with leading lines and shapes that travel across a space. So for example, using pipes so they flow into an exit, using lighting to indicate player paths, using rocks and landscapes that flow into a direction, etc. So Genshin Impact is a great example of composition in games because they use nature very intelligently to guide players through the world. So I highly recommend watching videos of playthroughs or even like playing the game yourself to learn from them. My next tip is to compromise between concept and level design blockouts. Many times, the initial blockout of a scene will not have the most beautiful configuration or composition. However, the beauty of working on environments is that you can take the initial concept art or art direction and try your best to inject it into the space while respecting the gameplay. One of the best feelings in the job is when you're able to find solutions for a space that is both fun and visually appealing at the same time. My last tip is if you end up in a larger company, you will have less control over how the resulting image looks like compared to working in a smaller company or working on a portfolio piece. Often, you will not be able to do any lighting in the scene, control how the background looks like, or art direct things like post-processing or environmental effects. In a bigger company, it is important to understand how to best contribute to the game within your role and trust your colleagues to handle the rest. This does not mean that you should not give them feedback, but it does mean that you shouldn't get hung up on making the scene look exactly the way you would ideally. Out of all these tips, the main realization for me is that you can never force the player to view the scene from a specific angle. So it is better to focus on making the general picture look good instead of making only one shot look incredible. When in doubt, here's a process I follow to make sure the end product is satisfactory. First, make sure you follow demands from level design. Some of their ideas are up for compromise and discussion, and if they're really good at their job, they'll let you know what those are. Otherwise, for layouts and decisions that are not up for discussion, follow their demands religiously. I mean, write them down, make a checklist, and every time you submit the level, make sure all those demands are met. So, because when level designers have to come back to you with the same point they had last time, it wastes both you and their time. After level design is happy with the preliminary art pass, you then go in and make sure everything looks pretty, but only within their demands. If you're having trouble doing this, ask for help from a colleague. Using this strategy, you will have to redo much less work, and if you're an intern, the level designer will be very happy with you and more likely to recommend you if they're asked for their input when deliberating about whether to offer you a position or not. Aside from technical differences, Joining a company will also be different in the sense that you'll be working with teams of other people. In my school and most other schools, you have assignments in which you work in groups to create a game. However, in most cases, there are people in the group who do not take the assignment as seriously as others. In a company, this is very different, as people are equally as passionate about the project as you are, which leads to a quite different dynamic. One of them is working with people that are not in art-oriented teams, such as programmers who might be working on a weapon that you're modeling, or level design, who design the level that you're dressing. Because their role is not art-oriented, it may seem difficult at first to connect with them because you would have very different objectives. For example, design wants a space to be easy to traverse, objectives to be crystal clear, while you may care more about how the space is composed and how it looks. But it is important to keep in mind that you do in fact have the same objective, which is to make a good game. Although you might want to place everything so that it looks perfect, it is important to learn to compromise and see the bigger picture. When you're working on a personal project, you're often working alone. However, in a company and especially if you're dressing scenes, it is important to realize that your work rests on the shoulders of many other people. Hence, no matter if you're presenting your work internally or externally, it is important to take a moment to give credit to the 3D artists, vegetation artists, material artists, your lead, art director, all those people that made this work possible. I also wanted to take a second to mention the importance of soft skills. Of course, being able to produce good art is important, but once you're in the industry, soft skills become important for your career growth, especially if your goal is to become a lead. I'm not going to go into this too much, but there are many resources online to help you improve. Things like communicating clearly, understanding other people's point of view, listening actively, and many more are great things to keep in mind during your day-to-day communications with your colleagues. And working on them will make you a more valued teammate. Many companies hold one-on-one meetings with your manager, and you can take those opportunities to ask for areas of growth in soft skills. Once you're nearing the end of your internship, which is hopefully filled with learnings and joy, what are some things you might want to think about? First, throughout your internship, it is good to establish good communication with your lead and mentor. This doesn't mean that you have to be best friends with them, but don't be afraid to ask about possible job opportunities within the company. As an intern or someone new in the industry, it is easy to feel inferior to your peers, and it can be scary to push for information or other things that you want. However, it is important to keep in mind that as much as the company is taking time to onboard and teach you, you're also giving them your time and work. Hence, understand that you're fully entitled to know whether you will be offered a job, and you deserve as much respect as anyone else in the company. So don't let yourself feel like you're being kept in the dark, and ask for transparency when it comes to a possible job offer. This also means that you may consider negotiating your salary, either if you get a job offer from the company you interned at, or if you receive another offer from another company. This can be very nerve-wracking, but go into it with confidence, knowing that you deserve to be paid what you're comfortable with, and that the worst outcome is that you get paid the initial offer anyway, so it wouldn't hurt. Often, even if you're performing really well, you still wouldn't know if you would be offered a job until very late in your internship process. Regardless if you get a job from the company, it is always a good idea to look for other job opportunities and interview during your internship. Even if you want to stay at your interning company, having other offers can give you leverage when you negotiate your salary. And it is always good to practice your interviewing skills. Lastly, if you do leave the company after your internship, make sure to thank people around you and let them know that you'd like to stay in touch. Once you're in the industry, the easiest way to get a job is through your network, so it is important that you take this opportunity to build it. So now that we've finished going through my learnings and tips for your internship, I'd like to jump into some learnings that I had that would be useful for your career afterwards. Although things may seem overwhelming at the start of your career, you will eventually become more comfortable in your role. However, through time, you might want to take on bigger and more important tasks. So how do you do that? First, don't be afraid to let your lead know what you'd like to work on. Sometimes it can be as simple as them not knowing what areas you'd like, leading you to not be able to work on the areas you want to. So be transparent with your lead. Second, taking on responsibility means trust from your teammates and lead. And the main way to achieve this is through being consistent. And this is a point that I will emphasize because this same philosophy applies no matter which industry you are. Showing up consistently is way better than showing up at your best occasionally. By showing up, I mean consistently delivering, fixing your bugs, being responsive, and being a good teammate. It may feel like you need to texture every asset perfectly or place rocks in just the right spots, but game development is often more about the whole picture looking better than the sum of its parts. So while it's great to put thought into what you're making, oftentimes it is better to instead focus on the bigger picture. For example, it doesn't matter if a prop looks good or environment looks good if it doesn't meet the specifications. Many people can make something look good, but it is more valuable to do it according to the brief consistently. This means making sure that you're sticking to the folder structure, naming conventions, metrics, and art direction consistently. Because if you're sticking to those things consistently, it will be way easier to trust you with more important tasks. Consistently showing up and doing the work that is asked of you builds trust way faster than being able to create a scene that looks good but doesn't work in the game. In a company, people who are consistently reliable and can see the bigger picture are incredibly valuable because you can trust them to get their work done and make sure that they will prioritize the right things. Learning these skills can take time, but those skills are precisely what people look for in more senior roles. Another important tip for furthering your career is to understand your goals. So this is a very interesting topic because many people who are new in the industry tend to idolize becoming a lead one day. However, it is important to realize the actual role of a lead. In most companies, leads hardly do any art at all, and most of their time is spent briefing tasks, making sure your results align with art direction, and many other more administrative tasks. The best leads are good artists, undoubtedly, but they are best at managing a team and making sure everyone feels like they're growing and being the middleman between artists and the needs of other departments. So not everyone is suited for being a lead, and it is not because they're not great at doing art, but it's because being a lead is a completely different role. You might feel that becoming a lead is a natural progression of your career as your artistic skills increase, but that is not the case. If you want to spend your career perfecting your craft, being a mentor for your colleagues, and being an advisor for how work should be done, then maybe being a principal artist should be your goal instead. Principal artists focus more on perfecting their craft, advising workflows, and giving feedback. And if that sounds more like your thing, then it might be a role that you'll be happier to work towards. Having said this, you definitely do not need to decide which path you'd like to take right now. The intention I have with saying this is to first prevent you from working towards a goal that will ultimately not make you happy. And the second reason is that knowing what you want to achieve helps you get there much more efficiently. It can take years to learn your goals, and that is completely valid and great, but it may still be of good interest to learn what your goals entail. Okay, so going on to the next part. The games industry is unique in the sense of how passionate the people in it are about their work. This can be amazing just because it is the best feeling in the world to be excited about work, like especially on a Monday, and being happy and fulfilled in your career when many other people struggle with feeling passion for their job. However, this is a huge double-edged sword. Many people in the industry suffer from burnout, and it can be difficult to turn off work when you're at home. I have learned many things about this during my time in the industry, and I would love to share them with you. As a student, you're expected to work after school, whether it be homework, self-studying, or making assignments and portfolio projects. This is really great, and you're able to see a lot of improvements in your skills. But once you start working, you might need to adjust the way you spend your time outside of it. So the way I see it is, the work that you were doing after school has now been shifted to your job. So naturally, you should fill up the rest of your day with other things. If your first job or internship is the first time you move out from a dorm or your parents' place, then you might suddenly find many more things that you need to take care of that weren't in your agenda before, like doing laundry, cleaning, and cooking. And you need to make sure that outside of work, you're leaving time to do those things. It is also interesting to reevaluate your relationship with 3D as a hobby. Because now that you're doing it for work, you might start to feel not as motivated to work on personal projects after work. This can be a very difficult feeling to cope with at first, and my only advice is to take it easy on yourself. If you push yourself to do personal projects in your spare time like you used to, even if you don't feel like it leads to a lot of resentment and suffering. Your time after your job should be spent relaxing and winding down, and it should definitely not be spent on more work. As long as you no, as you work for longer, you will find it easier to rediscover 3D as a hobby if you want to, of course. It could be things like trying out a new workflow, recreating an interesting concept, or experimenting with an idea. But the point is that you should have fun while doing it, because otherwise it's not a hobby, but work. So recently I decided to join an art station challenge, and I had a month to create an environment. Previously, I would have let everything else in my life go and become a hermit after my job to work on the project. However, I now know that this is not healthy, and if I want to keep doing environments outside of work, I need to keep it as a hobby and not something that consumes my life entirely. Pacing myself and only working on the challenge when I felt like it made the process so much more fun, and I suggest you try it too. It is also a great idea to look for other hobbies outside of 3D, such as owning plants or painting or clay sculpting. It is easy to fall into the trap of thinking that if you're not doing 3D, you're not progressing. It is a feeling that me and many other people around me have felt. However, creative hobbies that are not 3D can still have huge impacts on your creative output. For example, painting allows you to zoom in on fundamental art skills like composition, color, and proportion. All those skills are incredibly beneficial when doing environment art as well. That being said, the feeling of needing to be productive all the time is a really difficult one to tackle. Most people working in game companies get there because of incredibly hard work beforehand, because there's so much competition for the role. Therefore, even after you're in the industry, you might still carry over old habits. But it's important to keep in mind that grinding art did work in your favor for some period of time, but you won't be able to keep up those habits forever. Taking care of your life outside of work, whether it be working out or taking care of your surroundings or spending time relaxing, is equally as important as spending time working. Drink some water. All right. So next, I want to talk a little bit about burnout. So, the excitement of joining the industry, the nervousness of wanting to perform can cause you to do a lot of overtime or stress a lot. And this leads to negative behavior cycles and feedback loops in your head. In some cases, this ends up manifesting in doing a lot of overtime or taking small mistakes very, like, way too seriously. In the beginning, these negative mindsets will not make a huge impact on your life, but years down the line, it can culminate into something known as burnout. So, what is burnout? According to Google, it is a state of mental and physical exhaustion, and it happens when you suffer from long periods of stress. So, how does it feel like? I have not personally dealt with burnouts, which I'm really happy about, but I have heard of many cases where people are simply not the same after they've been burnt out, even after they recover. It's really a case of your body catching up with you, where it's tired of dealing with all the stress, and your body will put you in a state where you can not possibly work. So sadly, burnout is incredibly common in the games industry because we're so passionate about our work and put a lot of our pride and purpose into it. It is easy to work a lot of overtime to try to prove your worth or to feel like you're progressing. However, one of the most important things to keep in mind is that your time in the industry is a marathon, not a race. So this ties back into my notes on consistency because it is much better to consistently work an amount that you can handle over a long period of time instead of working a lot all at once and burning out, which will hinder you from working at all for a really long time. Everything I spoke about in the work life balance section is to prevent burnout because every time you allow yourself to relax without judgment or invest time in other hobbies that make you happy, you're making a bid to yourself that you will stay in the industry for longer. Burning out doesn't happen if you work overtime for a weekend or if you go through maybe a week of crunch. But it happens after years of bad working habits. So it's important to like set the foundations of good working habits for yourself so that you will live a generally happier life, work with a better mentality, and work in the industry until you can retire. It's easy to think that burnout can happen to you, but the scary thing is that everyone is as capable of getting it as any other, which is what makes it so scary. So I mentioned this quote before, but I love to emphasize it. So a colleague of mine once told me a really good quote, and that was, "Your games career is a marathon, not a race." And that quote really blew my mind because I've always thought that I needed to learn as quickly as I can and do things as quickly as possible and really rushing myself all the time. This quote made me realize that it's okay to take things slower because if I had kept pushing myself, I most definitely would burn out one day. But if I do not, then I can have a happy career for a long time. And I wish that for all of you too. So I hope you can um, get something from this. Okay. Finally, the last topic I wanted to speak about is imposter syndrome. So I don't think I've ever met a game artist who doesn't deal with it. So I'd love to give you guys some tips on how to handle it before we wrap up the presentation. First, understand that imposter syndrome isn't inherently a bad thing. Like all negative thoughts, they exist to help your existence in some way, even if they don't do a great job sometimes. So feeling like you're lesser to your peers allows you to hold yourself to higher standards and grow, which is a great thing. However, when you feel that your self-consciousness is crippling your ability to deliver, that's when you should be careful. Over time, imposter syndrome does go away. So when you get complimented on your work, when you get a raise, those all serve as proofs to yourself that you do belong where you are and that you're very appreciated in your position. But I mean, and those things certainly do help, but it's also important to not rely on external validation to make yourself happy, which is ultimately what imposter syndrome is. So my lead always says that game development is hard, and he's right. Not only is game development a culmination of many systems interacting with each other in real time, it is also an industry where the end product is scrutinized by many people who are very passionate about it. Small yet important decisions need to be made every day, and it's a miracle that any game ever gets finished at all. So it's okay to feel like you don't know what you're doing. I don't know what I'm doing 99% of the time either. When work feels really hard, understand that it's because it is hard. And if you're still unsure, be open with your lead and ask them about how they think you're doing. And they'll definitely be open with you. And if they're saying that you're doing good, then you definitely have nothing to worry about. So, yeah. So those were all the tips and learnings I wanted to present today. I hope that they can be help to you in your first year in the industry. Thank you so much for listening, and let's jump into some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Yinuo Chen, for taking the time to share this amazing workshop for us at Beyond Extent. Make sure to check out their work in the description below. We also want to throw out a big thank you for all of our Patreon supporters. These workshops are only possible because of it. Head on over to beyondextent.com where you can find access to our community, environment art resources, and get access to the live portion of these workshops in the form of a Q&A session. Stay creative, and I'll see you out there.